The past 40 years has demonstrated to everyone that has followed Iran that the demeanor and the pattern of behavior of this regime has remained consistent only in one way, and that is to continue fomenting regional instability and conflict as a means of its own survival by financing its proxies and utilizing them as an instrument of pressure or intimidation across the world. The Houthis are just one example of that. The majority of the funding came from Iran, the training, the weapons. So, it's not that they say we're going to quit the fight. Who is to say they're not going to start it again once Iran will start funding them again? Because this is what the regime is most likely to do. Khamenei said that this is a temporary setback, and he was forced into accepting the climate of indirect talks only to buy some time to the regime. They have done that before. So nothing leads us to believe that this time they have a complete change of behavior or attitude. And that's something that we should not fall into the trappings that this regime has set, not just to the current administration, but to previous administrations, and has always taken advantage of that in order to prolong its own survival.
I think President Trump is aware of the sentiments that you're making this morning, Reza, and I just wonder if, in fact, there is a different tact that this administration should be taking at this point. I mean, President Trump told me exclusively 2 months ago he sent a letter to Khomeini, and then they tried to mock that letter. What is the right approach?
Look, the president was absolutely correct during his first administration. The campaign of maximum pressure paid positive dividends. It forced Iran to do a retreat, cut a lot of the revenue that the regime would have had access to. Unfortunately, it was reversed under the Biden administration. The regime had in excess of $200 billion it should not have had, which was, of course, spent on not the people of Iran who are starving on the streets, but by reinforcing their proxies. October 7th was not just a coincidence. It's a result of that continued funding of the regime of its terror network. That is the component that President Trump, during his first administration, understood. Now, and as I said many times before, including on your show, maximum pressure in itself is not sufficient to remedy the problem. There has to be parallel to maximum pressure, a policy of maximum support to the Iranian people. Now, why is this important? Vice President Vance is talking about reintegration. The Iranian people are your true partner in peace. They are the alternative to a warmongering regime that has called death to Israel and death to America since its inception. It's not just a slogan, it's an actual belief. The IRGC, as a stated mission, has to export this revolutionary ideology across the world. They are not there to sue for peace and coexistence with their neighbors or beyond. That's what is missing in the ultimate understanding of foreign governments looking into Iran as to what is the alternative here. Of course, Iranians want to be integrated in free societies because they share the same values of the free world, not this regime. So negotiating with a regime that in its own DNA is simply incompatible with such integration is a waste of time. And the regime is gaining by dragging the feet to prolong its existence, hoping that maybe they will survive this administration, only to come back again and continue its policy of radicalism and violence. So when you look at Iran, I think this administration and many other governments should look beyond the regime itself and look at what's on the streets of Iran. What's the demand of the people? The people who chant, they lie to us, they say America is the enemy. Our enemy is right here in Iran. That's what the people are saying.
Yeah.
So that's the big distinction that needs to be understood at every phase of any discussions going on.
It's a very important
takeaway. The central takeaway from these parts is Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's strong condemnation of the Iranian regime as an untrustworthy entity that uses diplomacy to delay accountability while continuing to fund terrorism and suppress its people. He advocates for a policy of maximum pressure coupled with direct support for the Iranian people, who he believes are the key to overthrowing the regime. Pahlavi dismisses superficial gestures like renaming the Persian Gulf and highlights the regime's global propaganda efforts as a threat to Western institutions, urging the international community to prioritize the Iranian people's aspirations for freedom over negotiations with the regime. Analysis: Iranian regime's regional tactics. Pahlavi asserts that the Iranian regime has destabilized the Middle East for 40 years by funding groups like the Houthis with training and weapons. He doubts the reliability of the reported Houthi ceasefire, viewing it as a temporary tactic by Iran to gain time through indirect talks. His perspective aligns with reports of Iran's support for proxies, a well-documented issue in geopolitical discussions. However, his claim that there's no evidence of a fundamental change in the regime's behavior might be seen as absolute. Some analysts suggest that even temporary ceasefires could create opportunities for de-escalation, a possibility Pahlavi doesn't address, focusing instead on the regime's historical patterns. Comparison of U.S. policies. Pahlavi contrasts the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, which he says limited Iran's revenue, with the Biden administration's approach, which he claims gave Iran access to over $200 billion, funds allegedly used to support terror networks, including those tied to the October 7 attack. His support for Trump's sanctions reflects a belief that economic pressure can weaken hostile regimes. However, the $200 billion figure and the direct link to October 7 aren't substantiated here, which could undermine the claim's strength. Additionally, Pahlavi doesn't mention potential upsides of relaxed sanctions, like humanitarian aid or diplomatic progress, which some experts argue can help stabilize tense regions. This part shows his preference for tough measures but could use more discussion of their broader implications. Focus on the Iranian people. Pahlavi highlights the Iranian people's desire to join the global community, pointing to their protests and chants rejecting the regime's anti-American and anti-Israel rhetoric. He calls negotiations with the regime a waste of time, arguing that supporting the people is the only way forward. This aligns with reports of public unrest in Iran, such as the 2022 protests after Mahsa Amini's death. However, his outright rejection of diplomacy might overlook cases like the 2015 nuclear deal, which, despite limitations, temporarily curbed Iran's nuclear ambitions. His emphasis on grassroots change is powerful, but he doesn't address the practical challenges of organizing opposition in a tightly controlled state, which could affect his approach's viability. Persian Gulf naming proposal. Pahlavi dismisses President Trump's suggestion to rename the Persian Gulf, possibly to the Gulf of America, arguing it tries to change a historical reality. His position is supported by the term Persian Gulf being standard in international contexts, such as United Nations documentation. This part shows Pahlavi's ability to disagree with Trump on specific points, despite generally supporting his policies. While some might see symbolic gestures like renaming as having diplomatic or cultural weight, Pahlavi prioritizes practical issues, viewing such proposals as distractions from more urgent matters. Support and strategy for Iranians. Speaking directly to the Iranian people, Pahlavi praises their resilience in protesting despite repression and urges global support to strengthen their efforts. He suggests encouraging defections within the regime, citing examples like the Soviet Union and South Africa, where internal divisions helped topple governments. This strategic idea adds nuance to his argument, proposing that pressure could weaken the regime from within. However, he doesn't specify how defections could be encouraged or what form international support should take, leaving the idea somewhat vague. Critics might caution that external involvement could escalate tensions or be seen as meddling, a perspective Pahlavi doesn't explore. Iran's global influence. Pahlavi points to the regime's non-military influence through propaganda, lobbying, and academic presence, referencing a former Iranian official at Princeton and arrests in England linked to an attack on the Israeli embassy. These examples highlight concerns about Iran's covert activities, backed by reports of its global operations. However, his broad labeling of civilians, lobbyists, influencers, as regime agents risks oversimplification, potentially complicating relations with legitimate voices. Some might argue that engaging Iranian academics or civilians could foster dialogue, a viewpoint Pahlavi doesn't consider. His warning about threats during negotiations is reasonable but could acknowledge that diplomacy often coexists with such challenges. Objective evaluation. Pahlavi's arguments draw on his deep understanding of Iran's political history and his personal perspective as an exiled figure. His focus on the Iranian people's aspirations and the regime's destabilizing actions aligns with historical trends and recent events, resonating with those wary of the regime. However, his dismissal of diplomacy as ineffective may oversimplify a complex geopolitical landscape where negotiations can serve purposes like intelligence gathering or temporary stabilization. His reliance on maximum pressure and defections assumes a straightforward path to regime change, but he doesn't detail how to manage risks like regional escalation or civilian harm. Alternative strategies, such as targeted sanctions or support through NGOs, could complement his approach but aren't mentioned. Pahlavi's perspective is a compelling call for change but would be stronger with more attention to practical challenges and opposing views. Summary. In these parts, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi articulates a comprehensive critique of the Iranian regime, arguing that its history of funding proxies like the Houthis, suppressing its people, and engaging in global propaganda renders it an unreliable partner for diplomacy. He praises Trump's maximum pressure campaign for its economic impact but insists it must be paired with support for the Iranian people, who reject the regime's ideology and seek integration with the free world. Pahlavi dismisses superficial proposals like renaming the Persian Gulf, focusing instead on the need for international support to empower Iranians and encourage defections within the regime. He also warns of Iran's infiltration into Western institutions, citing examples like the Princeton case and recent arrests in England, to underscore the regime's global threat. Conclusion. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi presents a forceful case for abandoning diplomatic negotiations with the Iranian regime in favor of a dual strategy of maximum economic pressure and direct support for the Iranian people. His perspective is rooted in a deep distrust of the regime's intentions, informed by its 40-year track record of regional destabilization and domestic repression. While his call to empower the Iranian people is inspiring, it raises questions about feasibility and the potential costs of sustained confrontation. For policymakers, Pahlavi's arguments highlight the need to balance diplomatic pragmatism with moral support for Iran's dissidents, while remaining vigilant about the regime's covert influence abroad. Ultimately, his message underscores the centrality of the Iranian people in any long-term resolution to the country's political crisis, urging the international community to amplify their voices over those of the regime.